Hi, neighbors. We are back, and it is the fourth day of Christmas for our 12 days of Christmas read aloud with Charles Dickens' classic, A Christmas Carol. And we are on stave 3, and we have met the ghost of Christmas Present. And today we are going to jump right back in, and we are going to see what the ghost of Christmas Present has to show Ebenezer Scrooge. And when last we left the ghost of Christmas Present and Ebenezer Scrooge, we were just outside Bob Cratchit's house. Then up rose Mrs. Cratchit, Cratchit's wife, dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown, but brave in ribbons which are cheap and make a good show for sixpence. And she laid the cloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, also brave in ribbons, while Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into a saucepan of potatoes, and getting the corners of his monstrous shirt collar, Bob's private property, conferred upon his son and heir in honor of the day, into his mouth, rejoiced to find himself so gallantly attired, and yearned to show his linen in the fashionable parks. And now 2 smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they had smelt the goose and known it for their own, and basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion, these young Cratchits danced about the table and exalted Master Peter Cratchit to the skies, while he, not proud, although his collars nearly choked him, blew the fire until the slow potatoes, bubbling up, knocked loudly at the saucepan lid to be let out and peeled.
"Whatever has got your precious father, then?" said Mrs. Cratchit. "And your brother, Tiny Tim, and Martha weren't as late last Christmas Day by half an hour."
"Oh, here's Martha, Mother,"
said a girl, appearing as she spoke.
"Here's Martha, Mother,"
cried the 2 young Cratchit.
"Hurrah! There's such a goose, Martha."
"Why, bless your heart alive, my dear, how late are you?"
said Mrs. Cratchit, kissing her a dozen times and taking off her shawl and bonnet for her with officious zeal.
"We'd a deal of work to finish up last night," replied the girl, "and had to clear away this morning, Mother."
"Well, never mind, so long as you are come,"
said Mrs. Cratchit.
"Sit you down before the fire, my dear, and have a warm Lord bless you."
"No, no,
"There's father coming,"
cried the 2 young Cratchits, who were everywhere at once.
"Hide, Martha, hide."
So Martha hid herself, and in came little Bob, the father, with at least 3 feet of comforter exclusive of the fringe, hanging down before him, and his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch, and had his limbs supported by an iron flame. "Why, where's our Martha?" cried Bob Cratchit, looking round.
"Not coming,"
said Mrs. Cratchit.
"Not coming,"
said Bob, with a sudden declension in his high spirits, for he had been Tim's blood horse all the way back from church and had come home rampant.
"Not coming on Christmas Day?"
Martha didn't like to see him disappointed, if it were only in a joke, so she came out prematurely from behind the closet door and ran into his arms, while the 2 young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off into the wash-house that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper.
"And how did little Tim behave?"
asked Mrs. Cratchit, when she had rallied Bob on his credulity, and Bob had hugged his daughter to his heart's content. "As good as gold," said Bob, "and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful, sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you've ever heard. He told me, coming home, that he hoped the people saw him in the church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant for them to remember upon Christmas Day, 'Who made lame beggars walk and blind men see?'" Bob's voice was tremulous when he told this, and he trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and heavy. His active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to his stool before the fire, and while Bob, turning up his cuffs, as if, poor fellow, they were capable of being made more shabby, compounded some hot mixture in a jug with gin and lemons, and stirred it round and put it on the hob to simmer. Master Peter and the two ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession. Such a bustle ensued that you might have thought a goose was rarest of all birds, a feathered phenomenon, to which a black swan was a matter of course, and in truth it was something very like that in this house. Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy, ready beforehand in a little saucepan, hissing hot. Master Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigor. Miss Belinda sweetened up the applesauce. Martha dusted the hot plates. Bob took Tiny Tim beside him in a tiny corner at the table. The two young Cratchits set chairs for everybody, not forgetting themselves, and mounting guard upon their posts, crammed spoons into their mouths, lest they would shriek for goose before their turn came to be helped. At last the dishes were set on, and grace was said. It was succeeded by a breathless pause, as Mrs. Cratchit, looking slowly all along the carving knife, prepared to plunge it into the breast. And when she did, and when the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight arose all around the board, and even Tiny Tim, excited by the two young Cratchits, beat on the table with the handle of his knife and feebly yelled, "Hurrah!" There never was such a goose. Bob said he didn't believe there ever was such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavor, size and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. Indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit said with great delight, surveying one small atom of a bone upon the dish, they hadn't ate it all at last. Yet every one had had enough, and the youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows. But now, the plates being changed by Miss Belinda, Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witness, to take the pudding up and bring it in. Well, suppose it should not be done enough. Suppose it should break in turning out. Suppose somebody should have got over the wall of the backyard and stolen it while they were merry with the goose. A supposition at which the two young Cratchits became livid. All sorts of horrors were supposed. Hello, a great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper, a smell like a washing day. There was the cloth, a smell like an eating house, and a pastry cook's next door to each other, with a laundress's next door to that. That was the pudding. In half a minute, Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed but smiling proudly, with the pudding, like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in half of a quartern of ignited brandy, and bedight with Christmas holly stuck into the top. Oh, a wonderful pudding. Bob Cratchit said, and calmly too, that he regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Mrs. Cratchit said that now that the weight was off her mind, she would confess that she had her doubts about the quantity of flour. Everybody had something to say about that, but nobody said or thought it was at all a small pudding for a large family. It would have been flat hearsay to do so. Any Cratchit would have blushed to hint at such a thing. And at last, the dinner was all done. The cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, the fire made up. The compound in the jug being tasted and considered perfect, apples and oranges were put on the table, and a shovelful of chestnuts on the fire. Then all the Cratchit family drew round the hearth in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, meaning half of one. And at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers and a custard cup without a handle. These held the hot stuff from the jug. However, as well as golden goblets would have done, and Bob served it out with beaming looks while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and cracked noisily. Then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to us all. My dears, God bless us." Which all the family re-echoed.
God bless us, everyone,
said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat very close to his father's side upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his as if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side and dreaded that he might be taken from him. "Spirit," said Scrooge with an interest he had never felt before.
Tell me if Tiny Tim will live."
"I see a vacant seat," replied the ghost, "in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die."
"No, said Scrooge. No, kind spirit, say he will be spared."
"If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race," returned the ghost, "will find him here. What then? If he be like to die, he had better do it, and decrease the surplus population." Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words noted by the spirit, and was overcome with penitence and grief. "Man," said the ghost, "if man you be in heart, not adamant, forbear that wicked cant until you have discovered what the surplus is, and where it is. Will you decide what men shall live, what men shall die? It may be that in the sight of heaven you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child. O God, to hear the insect on the leaf pronouncing on the too much life among his hungry brothers in the dust." Scrooge bent before the ghost's rebuke, and trembling cast his eyes upon the ground. But he raised them speedily on hearing his own name.
"Mr. Scrooge," said Bob. "I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast." "The founder of the feast, indeed," cried Mrs. Cratchit, reddening. "I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope he'd have a good appetite for it."
"My dear," said Bob, "the children,
"Christmas Day." "Well, it should be Christmas Day, I'm sure," she said. "Oh, which one drinks the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge? Oh, you know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do, you poor fellow."
"My dear," was Bob's mild answer, "it's Christmas Day."
"I'll drink his health for your sake and the day's," said Mrs. Cratchit, "but not for his. Long life to him. A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. He'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt."
The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of their proceedings, which had no heartiness. Tiny Tim drank it last of all, but he didn't care twopence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for full 5 minutes. After it had passed away, they were 10 times more merrier than before, from the mere relief of Scrooge, the baleful, being done with. Bob Cratchit told them how he had a situation in his eye for Master Peter, which would bring in, if obtained, a full 5 and 6 weekly. The two young Cratchits laughed tremendously at the idea of Peter's being a man of business, and Peter himself looked thoughtfully at the fire from between his collars, as if he was deliberating what particular investments he should favor when he came into the receipt of that bewildering income. Martha, who was a poor apprentice at a milliner's, had then told them what kind of work she had to do and how many hours she worked at a stretch, and how she meant to lie abed tomorrow morning for a good long rest, tomorrow being a holiday she passed at home. Also, how she had seen a countess and a lord some day before. Now the lord was much about as tall as Peter, at which Peter pulled up his collars so high that you couldn't have seen his head if you had been there. And all this time, the chestnuts and the jug went round, and by, they had a song about a lost child traveling in the snow from Tiny Tim, who had a plaintive little voice and sang it very well indeed. There was nothing of a high mark in this. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof. Their clothes were scanty, and Peter might have known, and very likely did, the inside of a pawnbroker's. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time and when they faded, and looked happier yet in the bright sprinklings of the Spirit's torches parting. Scrooge had his eye upon them, and especially on Tiny Tim, until the last. And we will end there for day 4. And we are nearing the end, but we still have a ways to go. So I hope you guys keep coming back. I will keep being here. But in the interim, please enjoy your family. Enjoy the happy times that you get to spend together. And I will see you back here tomorrow for day 3. Have a good one, neighbors.